Good morning, Sophie. Thank you so
In
much for joining us. And we've just had a really lovely rendition of a very poignant song. So I'm sure that we'll get that to you in future, so as it's actually part of our recording, but part of something that might be worth seeing on on your own website. So we're really grateful for you joining us today. And I highlighted I'd like to now introduce Sophie Howe, our WOW's very own Wellbeing Commissioner, who has been setting the standards for futuristic wellbeing possibilities. And thank you, Sophie. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie Borodar Pawb. Thank you very much for inviting me to the launch of your very exciting 10-year plan. What I wanted to do is to just give you some context, really, around how this might fit with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And my office has been pleased to be having regular discussions with the Bronllys Wellbeing Alliance to try to encourage you to try and give you pointers as to ideas of things that you could include in your plan, but also to try and facilitate some good dialogue with the health board, which I know on some occasions has been challenging. But I think it's important for you to sort of understand how the work that you're doing is set in this kind of wider context of what we're trying to achieve here in Wales. So if you could bear with me just a moment whilst I try and share my screen. Right, where are we? Hopefully you might be seeing this now. Yeah, Jackie, you're nodding. Good. Sometimes you never know whether actually it's up there for everyone else. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Okay, so as you heard, I'm Sophie Howe and I'm the Future Generations Commissioner. What is the Future Generations Act? Well, those of you who've been heavily involved in setting out this 10-year plan, I know will need no introduction to the Future Generations Act because, of course, your plan is very much centred around that. But put simply, it places this duty on all of our main institutions in Wales, 44 public bodies, including the Welsh Government, all our health boards, our local authorities and so on, to demonstrate how they're meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And then this duty to improve the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. So Wales have recently been joined by a tiny nation, Gibraltar, who have passed an almost identical piece of legislation. Just last week, I was in a call with the UN Secretary General's office because the UN are thinking of establishing something similar at a UN level, which is hugely exciting. So Wales is really a kind of trailblazer in this regard, with lots of other people looking to follow our lead. I want to say a little bit about the post-COVID challenges that we're facing. And, I could have probably done about 30 slides like this just on some of these post-COVID challenges. But obviously, the pandemic has rocked our world, not in a positive way, albeit I think there are potentially some things that have come from the pandemic that have made us pause and think about the things that actually make life worthwhile. And lots of talk about not going back to the old normal. But nevertheless, some significant challenges facing us. So child abuse referrals in Wales up nearly 80%. Throughout the lockdown period, we could see only between about 1.2% and 6.1% of vulnerable children attending school. So there's no surprise in that, really. 65% increase in calls to the domestic abuse helpline. Oh gosh, typo there, not unemployment, but unemployment increased from 41,000 to 60,000 between June 2020 and January 21. Significantly in terms of health, a Guardian report from February 21 noted that 5 areas in South Wales featured in a top 10 list of the most COVID deaths per capita in the UK. So Rhondda Cynon-Taf, Merthyr, Bridgend, Blaenau Gwent and Neath Port Talbot. Not something that we should be proud of at all. And I'm going to talk to some of the reasons for that in a minute. Significant rises in poor mental health and significant significant challenges in terms of younger people and younger workers in particular being impacted upon by both mental health and loss of earnings and incomes being affected through the the lockdown sectors. But those are particular challenges in terms of the COVID crisis, but they're on top really of some of the existing challenges that we are facing. So I think this this image sort of paints or tells a story really around we were all taken by surprise really by the pandemic, but should we have been taken by surprise? So every year there's a global risk register which sets out the biggest threats and risks facing us all internationally, and practically every year the risk of a global pandemic is in the top 10 of global risks. I think back in 2019 it was number 8 in the global risk register, and yet none of us were prepared for that. We didn't have the PPE, we didn't have the infrastructure and so on in place to deal with the pandemic. We didn't have the services in place and so on. So there shouldn't, we shouldn't have been surprised, and we should have been prepared. What, however, is at number 1 of that global risk register, in fact is number 1, 2 and 3, and has been for the last number of years, is all issues relating to climate change and the nature crisis and emergency. So we cannot say that we don't know about this crisis. We have put more carbon emissions into the atmosphere since the UN published their first framework on evidence on climate change, and since Al Gore produced his first documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, than at any other time during human history. So we've done that knowingly. So there's a big challenge for us here in terms of, what are the things that we know about that we should be acting upon? We know, because the evidence tells us, that there's a potential for 250,000 additional deaths per year from climate change. We know that people are already dying in their thousands as a result of high levels of air pollution. And if you followed the case around the inquest of a young girl, I think it was last week or the week before that it was in the press, the coroner in that inquest identified that high levels of air pollution were a significant factor in terms of her death from asthma. So we know about these things. Are we doing enough? The UN predict that globally 1 million of the 8 million species on the planet will be extinct within 20 years. And I often talk about this is not about insects that nobody has ever heard of. This is about the fundamental foundations of our planet. So with the current model of economic development, we are eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihood, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide. So we have some significant work to do to reverse that decline in biodiversity. Moving on to health. 58% of the adult population in Wales are overweight or obese, perhaps even more worryingly. 26% of children. So, when we're talking about a pandemic and a public health emergency, I would say that this, or an outbreak, this is an outbreak. 14% of the Welsh population have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences during childhood. So this is growing up in households where there's domestic abuse, substance misuse, mental health problems, parental separation or incarceration. And for those kids who've grown up in households with 4 or more of those experiences, they're 20 times more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. They're 6 times more likely to have a teenage pregnancy. They're 15 times more likely to be substance misusers, and they're 3 times more likely to have long-term health conditions, and so on. So this is a public health emergency, which we know about. And then if you want to go really kind of macro in terms of economic policy, this increasing share of wealth concentrated in the 1% of richest people in the world. And you can see this shameful graph. Really, I would say that this is a public health disaster. So that kind of gap between rich and poor widening, and that increasing amount of wealth being concentrated in the hands of very, very few people. But let's step on to the some of the positives, perhaps. We do in Wales, as I say, have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is enabling us to do some different things. And, you know, whether that's stopping the government spending the entire of their borrowing capacity on building a 13-mile stretch of motorway, whether that's a new transport strategy, whether that's new planning policy in Wales, whether that's a new curriculum in Wales, which aims to educate young people in a future fit way for them to be ethical and informed citizens, entrepreneurial citizens, and young people who understand their issues relating to mental and physical health and well-being. For a country to have a set of long-term goals, yet it is. No other country has this set of long-term goals set out in law, so it can't change. They can't change from one government to the next unless they abolish the whole legislation. And then these 5 ways of working, which again are set out in the law. So our public bodies must demonstrate how they're planning for the long term, how they're integrating their thinking. So this is recognising the connections between things, recognising that you know, we might want to focus on improving the economy, but there are no jobs on a dead planet. Recognising that actually, you know, the way in which workforces operate are significant to the health and well-being of our nation, and so on. Involving citizens, and I think the work that you've been doing in Bronllys has been a really good example of a community grassroots movement involving people within your community, collaborating with across the public sector and with others. So again, that means our public bodies should be collaborating with organisations like yours and preventing problems from occurring or from getting worse. So in my, a lot of my work has been focused on highlighting where some of the challenges are and proposing new solutions for addressing these challenges. And one of the areas that I've been focused on is, you know, links back in a significant way to a number of those big challenges that I just outlined to you. And in particular, thinking about our health and well-being in a completely different way. So this graph here is from the World Health Organization, which possibly nobody had heard of prior to the pandemic, but now is you know, a regular feature on our news broadcasts. But they do more than just respond to pandemics and so on. This is a piece of work that they've done looking at the things that make a difference to quality of life or life expectancy in 36 European countries, including the UK. And what they've identified, it's might be a bit tricky to read the graph there, but in terms of our healthcare system, when we look at the life expectancy gap, particularly between, you know, so those who die at a younger age compared to those who live longer, this outlines the reason for that gap, or the reasons for that gap. And only about 10% of what makes a difference in terms of that gap relates to our healthcare system, so our NHS. 35% of what makes a difference to that is basically whether you're living in poverty. So it's financial insecurity, not being able to make ends meet. 29% relates to your living conditions, so poor quality housing and neighbourhood environment. Do you live in an area of high air pollution? Which, by the way, if you're living in poverty, you're also more likely to be living in areas of high air pollution. You're also less likely to be living with access to public open space and so on. And then 19%, again, really interesting. This is about social and human capital. So this is about the state of your relationships. Do you have people you can turn to in your hour of need? Do you feel like you're part of a community, and so on? And then 7% is about lack of decent work or poor working conditions. So I've been posing the question lately, if we know that evidence, are we guilty in Wales, in our healthcare system, in our public policy system, of willful blindness? So this is a quote from the Director of Public Health in Cwm Taf, which is the area which has had the highest rates of COVID deaths. If someone had pulled up any one of us in February 2020 and said there's a pandemic coming, can you fast forward 1 year and assess which communities would have the most severe severe hit from this pandemic, you could almost predict the picture we're seeing now with a reasonable degree of accuracy. So that's quite a damning indictment, really, on the public policy approach that we have taken to date, and is testament, really, to the changes that you are trying to make in Bronllys, which is helping to get us towards those wider determinants of health. So I'm promoting something called a national wellness system. What actually is that? Well, essentially, it's trying to move our healthcare system away from just treating people when they're ill. So we tend to park our ambulance at the bottom of a cliff and wait for people to fall off, and then we'll repair their legs or stitch them up when they do fall off, which is complete madness. What we should be trying to do is prevent that in the first place. So at a kind of a regional level or a national level, there are some really good examples in South Australia of what a national wellness system could look like. So you can see there, very much aligned with our Future Generations Act, a long-term vision, particular goals and milestones, and then a mission to build and maintain partnerships for investment and take action to reduce the preventable burden of disease and injury and promote health and well-being. And in South Australia, they've set out their own kind of well-being goals, if you like. Then at a local level, some of you, and if you haven't heard of it, I'd strongly suggest you go and have a look at it, and you can sign up to their newsletter. An area of London called Bromley by Bow, and there's a Bromley by Bow Centre, which is basically this national wellness system in action. So down the bottom here, you can see the sorts of services that they provide, services around your health and well-being. They provide, so it's a GP surgery, but then these routes out or in the centre itself to all of these other services, activities, sports and groups, help with looking for work or training, help to become an entrepreneur and start a new business. And this is my kind of favourite quote, most favourite quote ever. The centre must be the only place you can drop in a urine sample at the GP and end up joining a choir. Now that might seem a bit mad and a bit out there, but when we go back to that 19% of what makes the difference in terms of our health inequality being social relationships, a sense of community, that doesn't become, that moves from becoming the soft, nicey stuff to being the real core stuff of what we should be doing in our healthcare system. So if we go back to this graph, then I've also proposed a number of suggested sort of measures, both at local and national level, in terms of what this could look like. So addressing income insecurity, with the changing nature of work, with the stats that we've seen in terms of worklessness and unemployment now as a result of COVID, with the fact that so many people have fallen through the net because they've been working in what we call the gig economy, so on short-term contracts or freelance delivery people, for example. Year on year, we're seeing huge increases in people who do not work in full-time sort of secure employment with employment protection. We're seeing people work in the gig economy, and our welfare state is not geared up to supporting people like that who could be earning 300 quid one week and 50 quid the next. So a universal basic income, which provides that safety net to everyone, could, depending on the level set, could reduce poverty in Wales by 50%, which is absolutely huge in terms of its longer term benefits. Or if we set it at a higher level, it could completely eradicate poverty. So I'm calling for a trial of a universal basic income in Wales. We need to invest in skills and training to support a green-led and a care-led recovery. We often talk about green jobs, which are critically important if we're going to come out of this pandemic and not enter into that tidal wave of another crisis. But at the moment, we don't have the skills to be the electrical vehicle infrastructure fitters. We don't have the skills in land management. We don't have the skills to retrofit energy efficiency measures in homes. So what could we be thinking about from a health perspective around how we could help that and address some of those issues? Developing a food system strategy for Wales, linking all parts of the food system together from farm to fork, and then locally thinking about local food growing programmes, using community assets, which in your area you are so blessed with natural resources and community assets. And there's a really interesting programme in the Valleys, Project Skyline, which is aiming to reconnect people with their local environment and with the forestry and so on, which is on their doorstep, to provide them with training in land management skills, some potential business opportunities in forestry or sustainable tourism, but also to promote their wellness and so on. Procurement and the foundational economy. How are we spending our money? Are we spending our money, the £6 billion we spend in Wales on goods and services, in a way which is going to support better wages, which is going to support wellness in the companies that we procure from? Or are we spending it just in a way that we find the kind of cheapest short-term cost? Community sharing initiatives, community fridges, for example, where working with local businesses to set up a community fridge, so they donate, a bit like a food bank, but they donate the food that would otherwise be going to landfill to the community. Supported or subsidised accommodation, and I know that that's a feature of one of your plans. You know, again, the biggest increase in poverty is in-work poverty at the moment. So we cannot assume just by getting people into jobs, they're going to be taken out of poverty. And we know that some of our frontline care workers are those people who are in that in-work poverty. So thinking about some of those things around how you support those workers and take people out of poverty, which has a long-term impact on their health, critically important. And then take a placemaking approach to services. So map the services in your area and work out where the gaps are. And here are some examples of great things that are happening. So I've talked about Bronllys by Bow. There's the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund, which the government have recently given out, and there are things in there, really small things, like a housing association has been given £50,000 to set up an online platform which residents are able to report their repairs into this online platform, and it's matched then with a local trader who can make those repairs. Now, that's not rocket science, and that's a low-cost way of us saying, we're going to spend this money in the public sector, let's spend it locally with a local SME, rather than sending it, you know, to the other side of, you know, the other side of the UK to benefit mega industries. I haven't got enough time to go into to all of these. I thought you might be particularly interested in the Cardiff and Vale health meadows. So this is working with a community enterprise called Down to Earth, who work with people furthest from the labour market and upskill them in modern methods of construction and sustainable methods of construction. And in Cardiff and the Vale Health Board, they have they're developing a Wellbeing meadow. So instead of selling off their land for development, they're creating a meadow, which they will use as part of their kind of rehabilitation for the patients. But the way in which they're building some of the community facilities for that, they're using Down to Earth, who have that added benefit of working with those furthest from the labour market. And then if we move on to the 29%, so living conditions. So a right to adequate housing should be enshrined in law. Not relevant for all communities, particularly challenging with rural communities, but 20-minute neighbourhoods. So how can we try to ensure that we create a system whereby you can access the services that you need within 20 minutes, walk or cycle or public transport link? The transport strategy, so a focus on active travel and bigger investment, bigger investment in public transport, and then requirements for green infrastructure on our buildings. So we don't want to be building concrete jungles. We want to be thinking back to those environmental conditions that are going to also, you know, be good for the environment, good for nature, and be keeping people well. And then locally, working with local housing associations, they have a route directly in to local people, their wants and needs and aspirations. How can we be working with them? Placemaking for health. So how well are we connected in with the local development plan? How well are the health board talking to the local authority around around what development looks like. And again, I suppose a key aspect in terms of what you're trying to achieve. Linked to climate change strategies, think about staff active travel charters, think about digital innovation in terms of how that can help with our living conditions. And there's lots of really interesting models around digital innovation in care in particular, but also we need to be thinking about digital exclusion. So those people who are not au fait with using new technology. And again, really pleased to see that some of that is featured in your plan. So some examples here, we've got, this is the Valleys National Park, we've got park runs. We're starting to see now GPs across Wales who are setting up their own park runs because they're recognising that actually they don't just want to be issuing prescriptions for statins or for antidepressants, they want to get their population active. And so one of the things they can do is help to establish these park runs. All sorts of examples there around planning and infrastructure where communities are being cleaned and greened. Another example from Swansea Bay, UHB, who are working with the National Botanic Gardens to create sites for nature on their estate. So again, looking at how they can use that for the benefits of health and well-being of their patients and so on, but also helping to restore nature and biodiversity. When we then look at the 19% relationships, so I think there needs to be a national leadership around a social prescribing model. And, you know, I would say that what you're proposing in Bronllys is very much akin to a social prescribing model. So how could we get to a situation whereby if you go to your GP with, you know, early signs of perhaps needing a hip replacement or a knee replacement, that you're referred into the outdoor gym with a coaching program around that? How could we get to a position whereby if you're going to your GP, or perhaps ideally even before you're going to your GP with depression or anxiety, that there's a friendship group or a local community group or some of the things that you're proposing there? How actually could we think about that even before we get to that in terms of the way that we plan and design and build through, for example, intergenerational living programs? So we could be pairing older people who are at high risk of loneliness and isolation with younger people, maybe the nurses and the carers that you're describing, who could have subsidised housing, but actually be contributing to addressing the loneliness and isolation challenge as well. I think that we should be thinking about embedding kindness in public policy. What do I mean by that? I think that public policy and the way we deliver services has gone too far in terms of, I'm really sorry to pause here. The school is ringing me. Would you mind if I just pause for 30 seconds and asked, just checked if it's not a crisis? Just bear with me a second. In fact, I'm going to shout down to my husband and ask him to...
It's lovely to know you're human.
I can't find my mute, so you're going to have to hear me screaming as well. Sorry, bear with me a second.
Okay. I'll mute you. There's some really interesting concepts are being highlighted here, and a lot of which is the communities that have invested time and thoughts into our next 10-year document have actually highlighted and said. So hopefully we can actually work together to actually implement some of these into practice and make sure that our future in Bronllys and surrounding areas is bright, and that we look at the challenges that highlight poverty in the area and make sure that we don't have as bad as it could be. So you'll have to
Okay, I'm really sorry about that. They rang twice and I was getting alarmed that it might be an emergency. So, right, where was I? So the national wellness system focusing on social relationships. Some great examples here. The community fridges that I talked about. Out of breath now, running up the stairs. The Gwent Frindy Me intergenerational projects to tackle loneliness and isolation. I'll send you these slides, so you know they might be things that you want to look at to build into your plans. So the next 10 years for you, I've been blown away really by the ideas that you've come up with. I know that it's challenging in terms of how do we get public services to shift towards this new model when really, you know, they're being monitored on the basis of their waiting times. They're being monitored on the basis of short-term measures. So it's hugely challenging to move to this new kind of aspirational model. I think that there is a real need for you to be working with the whole community, all of the different organisations, and a real need for you and the health board to come together to see what is possible. It's quite likely that not all of the aspirations that you have in your plan will be deliverable, but I don't think that that should stop you from thinking big. I don't think that that should stop you from coming up with the ideas that fit with some of these long-term aims that we're trying to work towards. And so I'd really encourage you to carry on the good work that you're doing, to carry on the conversations with the health board. I know there's been some challenges there, so I think a coming together would be really good. And, you know, I've had a conversation with the health board recently where I've said, you know, what I would really like to see is that in-depth dialogue happening and detailed conversations. A sense of honesty around what might be possible and what might not be possible, and, you know, and a compromise in terms of how we move forward. So I think that that's what I would like to see. I think that's what the Act would like us to see as well. And quite frankly, I think that that's what the future generations of your area would like to see too. So thank you, Diolch yn fawr.
Joch and Val, Sophie, that was wonderful. I must say, I'm really grateful, and we've been very lucky to have your support, and your input with the health board as well has been fantastic. So we're really grateful for that, and hopefully, you know, we will progress some of these things. We recognise compromise has to be made for everybody. I've got quite a few questions, and I know you have to go. So, but hopefully I'm going to explain to others afterwards. But if there's just one, I'm going to put, there's quite a few ongoing, but one that is really important from Hay Town and Community Council, the Town Council. How can town and community councils best support moving forward?
Yeah, great question. So I think that town and community councils have, you know, have got some real kind of assets in that they are the you know, the infrastructure which is closest to the community, so most likely to know at a very local level what is needed in the community, and most likely to be in that kind of dialogue. So I think that there are a few things that can happen. I think it would be great, you know, and we're already seeing brilliant examples from some town and community councils. Just the larger ones are covered by the Future Generations Act, but that doesn't stop every other town and community council setting out their own local wellbeing plan for their area and trying to deliver against that. I think that there's, you know, I know that sometimes town and community councils find it challenging to engage with the other public services, and I have to say that I don't think that that's because town and community councils are the problem. I think that the bigger infrastructure of public services is sometimes, you know, the door is you know, wedged shut, and it's difficult to get in. But I think you have to be tenacious, continue to be tenacious and vociferous in trying to politely force your way in. And I think that, you know, never think that anything is too small. Within our local areas, there are so many small things that we can do to try and get to some of those long-term goals that I've been talking about. So I've published a set of they're called journeys to each of the wellbeing goals. There's 7 wellbeing goals, and the way we've set that out are, here are some simple changes that you could make. So for example, this could be very, very relevant for a town and community council. Don't cut the grass. Now you might think, well, what is she talking about, not cutting the grass? Don't cut the grass, plant wildflowers instead. Engage with the local school in terms of explaining why you're planting wildflowers, why they're good for pollinators, why pollinators are important to the very fabric of our society, and so on. And, you know, you've help to improve nature and biodiversity. You've provided learning opportunities for young people in your area. And by the way, you've saved yourself a few quid because you're not cutting the grass. So there are just some simple things like that. Have a look on my website. It's called The Art of the Possible. Each of the 7 wellbeing goals, simple changes, being a bit more adventurous and owning your ambition. And it'll give you some practical ideas of what might be possible.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And I know Tom has also wanting to get away as well. So I'm so grateful for you. And you've made On the Verge member Martin Draper extremely happy, because that is exactly what they're trying to achieve at the moment. So thank you for that. But thank you for everything, actually. And I'm sure that if we have all your questions, we'll send them to you and to Pep, who we're very grateful for the help and support. And they'll be able to put them on our website and get those answered for everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Have a very good day yourself. Diolch yn fawr.
Oh, thank you for having me, and I'm sorry about the interruptions. Let's hope there's no broken bones in school.
Yeah, I was meant to say that, actually. I hope everything's okay, but that you wouldn't have come back if it wasn't. So thank you kindly again. Take care.
Bye. Bye.